Welcome to Africa Answers, a series which features young African leaders who will be unpacking topical issues affecting Africa and proposing solutions to those challenges. I'm your host, Silindile Mlilo. Today in studio, I have my guest, Anika Dorothy Jane. She's the head of advocacy at Amplify Girls, and she's also a strong advocate for women issues. Welcome, Anika.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining me, Anika. Today we'll be unpacking all things women, feminism, and how we can move forward with gender equality. To start off the discussion, I want us to maybe reflect on where we are. We know now that, gender equality is one of the top priorities or top issues, right, that we're currently grappling with in the 21st century, right? From your take and from your experience in working around these issues as a practitioner, as an advocate, where are we, especially within the African context, right? And how does the future look like?
Well, in the African contexts, especially where I come from, I think it would be prudent to say that we have made progress. We're not there yet, but we are making progress. I think the world in general currently is facing a sort of fatigue with the engendering of the continent or, of the world. Mainstreaming the gender conversation has, I think, taken a backseat. When we went to Beijing in 1995, there was an awakening, a renaissance that, change has come, that women knew everywhere, whether you're in the kitchen, we knew that women have gone to Beijing and it is going to change our lives. And we, me and you, are those whose lives were impacted by Beijing. The African civil society contributed to the most important part. I know every part is important, but to us, Africa, the most important part of the 12 critical actions was the girl child that was solely developed by the African women and the civil society movement of Africa. And this is where we firmly named SGBV, early marriage, FGM, education for the girl child, and so forth. And so we are the products, the 30-year-olds of today are the products of that movement. And today we have, in Africa, mainstreamed a lot of gender equality policies, documents, conversations. But the momentum globally is waning because it feels like, it looks like we are there. But when you look at the intricacies of intersectionality, we still have a long way to go. In my country, currently, they just reported that 248 teenagers are sitting for national examination in a single county. So that tells us that as much as we look like we have made progress, we have taken 10 steps back, especially in the face of COVID.
Why do you think that? Why do you think the progress is slow?
Well, I think the issue is in demarcating the public and private spaces. And I have always opined that the way to achieve gender equality is not to separate public and private spaces, but to merge them and move in gender equality as one, because we have personalities for both men and women who exhibit or practice gender equality in their homes differently from the way they practice it in their workplaces. And this reflects in the overall, achievement of gender equality. So you will find that in this household, we grew up in empowerment, but our brothers grew up in patriarchy within the same household. We were told to beat all the boys in class, but our brothers were told do not step in the kitchen by the same parent. And it's sort of like we were not talking to each other in this household. And now we are bigger. And we have created, social media has created a terminology called toxic feminism, which they have defined as anything negative to do with, women empowerment. And there's a lot of lack of education, lack of awareness about what exactly feminism is, not only in the society with, with men and women, but also within the women's movement itself, within the women's society. I think the biggest thing also taking us back today is women as agents of patriarchy, which is a conversation that we're not ready to have. but it's there. So understanding what feminism is really one of the issues that is taking us back. And the feeling that we've talked about women and your empowerment for so long, let's focus on other things. Let's talk about climate change. But what they don't realize is that feminism intersects all levels of governance, society, living. It's a day-to-day principle that affects GDP, economic status, output, standards of living. It's not a one standalone issue.
Yeah. We're going to unpack feminism, but before we do that, I'd like you to reflect on, because there's also this conversation, right? While we're talking about gender empowerment or empowering women, right? There's also this other conversation where people feel that we should do it in tandem with also equipping men, because you spoke about how the same men are being raised in a patriarchal home, right? So there's this debate on the other hand that says that while we're empowering these women, we should also empower the men to be able to function in a society where women are empowered. Right. What do you have to say about that?
I think that's absolutely true. I think even the women who have made it in spaces of decision making have had support of feminist men or men who support, the gender equality agenda. I think my approach would be more radical and say that because the homes exist as inherently patriarchal spaces due to culture and society, and in some spaces religion, we need to have gender equality being taught as a basic principle in schools. Because you've noticed that even as we grew up, whatever the teacher said overrode any advice sometimes that parents give, especially at an early age. Teacher said is usually countered when a mother says ABCD. So I think it's really important that children grow up knowing that gender equality is a basic principle of life, because I think parents have failed thus far to inculcate this value into their children equally. That, you teach your girl exactly what you teach your son, and then they grow up together. Because today, the fact that we left boys behind in the conversation means that men are creating terminologies. They're not understanding these women. We are in actually a gender war amongst this generation that is not necessary. It's not supposed to be a love-hate relationship. And you will find that even the men and boys are very empathetic towards their sisters, their mothers, and their daughters, but have an inherent basic hate for their wives. And it's really funny to me that I don't know why that a wife is not seen as a woman. And you know why this issue is very critical is because wives intersect the spaces of, single-headed households or breadwinner households or equality in the workspace, equal pay. So that's why I keep on saying that to talk about gender equality, its existence in the public professional space should not be exclusive to its mainstreaming in the private space as well. Yeah, but I definitely think that men and boys have been left behind in the conversation. We have spaces of he for she that are now, that are prominent. And I'll give you one case study in Kenya, which is where I come from. So a lot of my examples may come from there. In combating FGM in the northern region, they created something. FGM is the female genital mutilation of girls. That is when you, to put it crassly, cut the clitoris of girls to subdue their sexual desires. Exactly. Thank you. So because our former president was very passionate about ending FGM, and there's a whole board in Kenya just to deal with this issue, and they're very punitive sentences with justice and everything. But we still felt like there was an issue. We were still not achieving zero rates of FGM, when we were still not. And so they started a men's program, and they're on Twitter, Men Against FGM. I think, they can find them on Twitter. And one thing the men said, the older men, they said, FGM exists in isolation from them. It is required, but they just hear it happened. And so there's a civil society organization that created a video of what actually happens during the FGM process. And when those older men saw it, they said, this will never happen to my daughter. And as a community, they're trying to eradicate this by following up on the mothers. But then you're also looking at children, women who are circumcising 2-year-old girls. so that, they don't have the agency to say yes or no, and, all these things. So I think men as allies of the feminist movement and gender equality is critical. And most critical is that they understand why it is, imperative that we are together on this journey at a young age, and not having to sort of preach or convert, people at an advanced age, when people already have set beliefs, set cultures, and set expectations as well, in their private spaces.
Yeah. I like the point of bringing men into, bringing men into the conversation, and also as being part of the solution, right? And touching on feminism, you just gave an example, if I got you correctly, of the term that's currently emerging. I think it's toxic feminism, right? Touching on that, because I know a lot of women who shy away from identifying as feminists because they don't understand what the term feminism is, right? When they think about feminism, they think of the westernized concept of feminism, which doesn't really relate to them from, let me just say, from an African perspective, since we're talking about Africa, as a continent, not necessarily from a Kenyan perspective, just to contextualize that. What would you say your definition of feminism is? And is there a difference between African feminism and Western feminism?
Well, that's a rich question. There have been conversations. Of course, one misconception is that the women's movement should not have disagreements. And when women disagree, then it's, they are women. There's a misconception that women are their own greatest enemies, because it has been propagated and believed that we are born jealous of each other or something. And so one thing I'd like to say, even within the women's movement globally, there are differences in beliefs. And differences in beliefs come from differences in lived realities. And that is why today, in gender equality, we talk about leaving no one behind in all their intersectionalities and in all their diversities. Because we have to accept that people are different. And that is the same also with, the feminism of Africa and the Western feminism. And that is why we specifically have African feminism that has been developed, propagated, and accepted by African women scholars. For a long time, the women of Africa felt like the agenda for the women's movement was set in, European and Western spaces, and it did not resonate with them. And African feminists have developed terminologies that reflect their brand of feminism or their culture, their way of feminism. And there are various, categories. We have Siwanism, which looks at institutional structures. We have motherism, nurturing and mother of the nation, which is really key in Africa because we had kingdoms that were matrilineal, and we really looked for up to our women leaders, inherently as we grew up before we got to colonial spaces and structures. And it has also been opined by African women scholars that the deep entrenchment of patriarchy came in also with a wave of colonialism from the European spaces. Because before that, women were revered in society. The allocation of duties, the respect that women were accorded, the voice, the agency that women had before colonialism was great. But colonialism came with a triple yoke of oppression, where now you are not only in Africa, then you are a woman, and then you're Black, right? And it's a concept developed in South Africa. And that's why they say you strike a woman, you strike a rock. But I would say, yes, there are differences in African and Western feminism because of the different priorities that also come with the cultural and economic conditions that we have. A woman maybe in the Western space, they could talk about equal pay as a priority. Or as my recent visit in the European Union, they talk about accessibility of women in buses, in public transport. Coming to Africa, public transport is privatized. The seating structures are very different in terms of you could have paid for a single seat and you have 3 chickens and you have 3 children and 2 chickens and 3 bags. I think Obama in his book Dreams of My Father explained it so well when a woman just, put a baby on his lap and, you're supposed to go with it, right? In addition, you have systems here that allow you to have water in your tap, safe drinking water. You look at UNICEF saying that a girl basically loses around, around 2 hours every day walking 2 or more kilometers to look for water. Those are not realities for Western Europe in many spaces, or even the USA. Access to holistic education is not a challenge as much as it is in Africa. We are still talking about making education free for all. There are spaces that have made education free, right? But have connotations of, school feeding program, for example, in Rwanda or in Kenya. Just recently, the government subsidy or government capitation has been withdrawn, right? Because the economy is very volatile right now. So the way African women have exhibited their feminism and created African feminism was to say, we recognize that we are together in solidarity in the overall advancement of women, but we need to address the realities that we have here now. The patriarchy that we have here now, promoting and cementing SGBV and GBV in spaces, promoting FGM, early marriages, is not the same as what you have. For us to be able to achieve our goals and advance gender equality, sometimes we have to look at motherism as a methodology. We have to look at snail feminism, that was developed in Nigeria, which said, let us not be as combative. It broke away from radical feminism and said, let us use our femininity to go slow and find how to convince men in the space to achieve what we want. In peace and security, they talked about nego feminism, which is the negating of no ego in conversations of peace and war, negotiations of peace and war. And they noted that when women are on the table in negotiations of peace deals, these deals tend to last longer. So yes, it is just now that Europe has experienced what it feels like to be in war. There are spaces in Africa, West Africa, especially Central Africa, now with DRC, that have in perennial systems of war. And so there's no way that the feminism of Africa can be the same as the feminism of Europe, because the priorities are entirely different and their realities are different as well.
Yeah. So what I'm getting from you is we can have one common goal, but it's important to ensure that we don't apply an umbrella or like a one blanket, sort of like approach to the solution, because it's context based. It depends on so many factors, right? And it also does not mean that just because we differ at a certain angle or at a certain point, we are still not of the same, we're still not of the same goal, essentially.
Right.
Cool. So, still drawing on that, because I really want us to unpack this. Still drawing on that, because you've already clearly highlighted the differences between, feminism in the West and feminism in the African continent. The African continent itself is diverse, right? We have the northern part, which is often, from a geopolitical point of view, it's often grouped with the Middle East, right? And then you have the sub-Saharan Africa, and then within even sub-Saharan Africa, we have East, West, Central, and Southern Africa, which are completely different from a cultural perspective, right? Economics, so many things, right? Some are more developed, less developed. Do you think that there are also differences within those contexts? Within Africa?
Within Africa, yes, of course, there are different contexts, because as you see, the issues of peace and security, the issues of apartheid that are experienced in South Africa, the issues of colonialism, neocolonialism that is now being enforced and entrenched by France in Western and Central Africa, contribute to different conversations. So you'll find that the feminism of West and Central Africa could be entrenched in women, peace and security for now, today, in rebuilding, in building back better, not just from COVID, but even from war. And that creates differences. In the northern part of Africa, we have, Sharia law in some spaces. That's a different kind of feminism of saying, I need agency and autonomy over my body, right? In East Africa, where we have experienced relative stability, notwithstanding the issues in DRC right now and Somalia, which has always had terrorism issues, they have a conversation about representation. They have moved from wanting to be alive in a war to representation, resourcing, rights. They're on that level of, When we come to South Africa, because of the inherent systematic, atrocities that were committed during that period of apartheid, then their realities are different. And they actually are a society that, really revered women in the spaces of their cultural contexts. But we have the patriarchal spaces as well that have entrenched, their solidarity in alienating women out of spaces of decision making. So the conversations would be different in each region, and conversations would trigger different reactions because of past trauma and past experiences. And so that's why I say differences, diversities, do not mean that we are still not united in the common cause of advancing gender equality and achieving equality, globally.
Yeah. I like the fact that you touched on representation, and I'm going to get there. But you really unpacked this very well, right? And showing all the contrasts.
Right.
But where's someone would ask, so then where's the middle ground, right? How, with all these differences, yes, we're fighting for a common goal, but we also recognize that there are also these differences that each context has to deal with first, right? Before we also get to that one big goal. Where would be the middle ground? How do we ensure that within all these different contexts, how does the global North support, the global South countries? Within Africa, how do we different regions support each other to ensure that we're moving towards the same goal?
Well, that is where feminist movements and building solidarity comes in. The civil society is a big part, is actually the engine of the solidarity of the women's movement, especially in Africa. Civil society has held governments to account. Civil society actually are the ones who agitated and advocated for the creation of UN Women as an branch or office at the in the UN structure. Civil society, as I said earlier, the ones who created the Girl Child and the Beijing Platform for Action. Civil society holds spaces, people, governments, regional, integration. They hold all the spaces to account. So bringing together, the middle ground is when we come together in movement building. But we have received support from, regional, continental bodies, from the African Union, which has a gender policy document. And there has also been appointments of ambassadorial special envoy roles for women in this continental and regional bodies. Governments today have special advisors on women's rights, right? In some countries, it is undermined, but in some countries, it is, revered prominently. And each woman has been able to achieve, different things. During her reign at UN Women as UN Women Executive Director, Pumzile Mlambo was able to establish, together with, Special Envoy for Peace and Security, Benita Diop, they were able to establish the African Women Leaders Network, which brings together all young and old women together in an intergenerational conversation to reinforce the solidarity and the stability of the women's movement in Africa. So we are leveraging on building spaces that bring us together, and not only bringing us together, but using our various positions to invest resources and capacity towards these spaces. So there are, ongoing conversations in the Pan-African movement space, Pan-African Parliament as well. The regional economic blocs are having specific conversations in, gender equality, and they have whole departments. The Africa Development Bank has also been at the forefront of driving the women's conversation. And actually, it is Africa that has the biggest financing, model for women. I think at 5 billion, that is supporting the entrepreneurship of women, in the African continent. So there are many spaces that we try to come together, and not only try, we are doing it. And we are also monitoring progress of things like the Maputo Protocol. When we come together to say this is the document that we want to do, at the AU level, we lobby for adoption from our governments and presidents to sign on to these documents. And we also go a step further to ensure accountability and implementation of these documents. And let me tell you, we have a lot of documents in Africa on the progression of women's issues and gender equality. Right?
Yeah, yeah. No, it's great to see that. Of course, there's so many challenges, but it's great to see that there's also movement at the same time, right? Earlier on, you touched on representation, and I think as a woman now, and as a child growing up, representation mattered so much, especially for a Black girl, right? Because growing up in the 90s, we were not seeing that representation on television, right? That wasn't represented for us. Even, for example, standards of beauty were not represented. So when you talk about representation, it's a big deal, because I really believe that it's important for a girl child to grow up seeing a person looking like them, in high positions or in levels of influence, because it gives the impression that if she can do it, it's possible.
Right.
But then when we speak about representation at the same time, there's also this conversation, right? Because when we are talking about women empowerment and gender equality, we're also talking about ensuring that women are in spaces of influence. Women are occupy spaces of governance and leadership, right? And we're seeing those steps, right? We currently have the Tanzanian president who's female. I think Malawi also had a female president, right? We've seen those even in other spaces, like you spoke about Mampumzile, right? Mlambo. So for you, when we speak about this, yes, it is important. And we've seen women with influence. But on the other side, there's this conversation that sometimes we put women in position of power to tick boxes, right? As a tokenist approach, right? That essentially the women don't even have the power or the agency to influence change on the ground. What's your take on this?
I think it's a really important conversation as we advance women equality. Sandra Heading called it Add Women in STAR, where, in science, it was in science that the STEM area that was largely male-dominated. And so to engender the space, they would just pick a woman, whether qualified, just pick a woman and put her there and look like you're gender sensitive or representative. And we have also had instances where even as women question the qualifications, the authority of women appointed to various spaces, feeling like they were not qualified, the means that they used to get there was not very friendly to their moral status. These are things that are there, and we must talk about them if we want to change the narrative. But what I can say is the stories of women are different. The capacities that they have are also different. The methodologies that they have been forced to use are also different. But this does not diminish from their capacity to deliver and their capacity as leaders. And it took a long time for women also to start clapping for any woman getting to those spaces, irrespective of what you believe and what you think, because today we are more liberal, and we know that your belief system must not entirely be my belief system, right? And one thing that I would like to say is that it took us a long time to get to the place where mandatory representation of gender is something that we talk about. We still have spaces that, women are a minority, right? And we are having spaces that women are becoming a majority. And it's becoming upsetting to have a women's majority in a commission, in a board. It's starting to cause a bit of discomfort. Why? Why should it look like it is a problem? It has been normal to have a male majority. It should be normal to have a female majority in leadership. Women have historically had to work twice as hard to get half of what men have in leadership, in economic spaces as well. And we are not looking at that. If you ask any woman what she has to do to prove her worth in a space, she will tell you she either fact checks all her work, she reads extra, she tries not to be emotional, right? She tries to be diplomatic. She doesn't want to take strong opinions on spaces lest she'll be removed from the space because this space has been handed to her. And in my own personal experience, this is why I created Young Women in Political Parties Leadership in Kenya. Because we find that a lot of young women's representation in political spaces was because of appointments. Because the space is inherently patriarchal and dominated, by male. And so you'll find that, when now you're given the power, how do you develop your agency? So agency is a topic that is a conversation that is now starting to come up. Building agency. And where I work, like at Amplify Girls, we build agency. We are talking about building agency from, the basic level of girls, adolescent girls, that you need to grow up in agency for you to be able to change your life story, your trajectory, and advocate for yourself. We have women today who are, above 25, who still do not have agency in their workspaces, in their private spaces, in families, in social spaces. And so I think it centrally comes back to agency. Because once you are able to accept, acknowledge, and believe that you are a leader and you need to be in this space, then you're able to take up the space more. And not only that, push as much as possible for the reforms that you believe are important. And so I always negate the notion or the belief that, no woman, this woman was not entirely, didn't get this the right way. I look at, let us judge by the scorecard. Because the number of times men sit in a bar and award themselves contracts, nobody raises eyebrows for that. And even when we come to accountability, women are held to 10 times more standards of accountability than men. We have corruption cases that are just dwindling and going nowhere. But if a woman is in that space where she's corrupt, then it is a representation of all women's leadership.
Yeah.
And so I think these disparities are things we need to check personally, that why are we holding women to a higher standard? Because we are looking at them as a supreme being, maybe because of their biological capabilities, they bring birth to, they bring life to the world. But then again, if that is how you hold them in such extreme, supreme respect and reverence, then why not accord them the respect and the equal opportunity that you believe they should, that they are. So yes, representation is still far off. In some spaces more than others. In spaces like Rwanda, of course, it's higher, it has been revered. But there are also underlying issues in their agency. And also coming from a war, those are things we cannot ignore as well. In spaces like in Kenya, we've had elections. We've been progressively increasing the number of women governors from 0 to 3 to 7. And we even have a county in Nakuru where all representation for members of parliament, senate, and governor are women. It's progress. We are slowly changing the narrative in communities and societies that prove that women can lead. But the issue is, why do we need to prove that women can lead? That is what gender equality is here to address. We don't need to prove it. We don't need to hold a track record and say, see, these are the counties that had women and this is how they're performing. So if you want good life, you need to have a woman in leadership. No, we just need to say that because she's a human being, the way a man is a human being, then they are accorded equal opportunity. That is the basic tenet of gender equality. Right?
100%. You've said it all. So you've said it all. I think maybe we'll shift a bit. Since we are here in Europe.
Right.
Yes, and you're about to leave us soon. But, we've been talking about Africa-EU relations. Right. This has been basically at the center of why we are here. Right. From a policy level, are there any global policies around women and issues of gender equality, feminist policies that are that have been developed at a global level and are starting to trickle down at a local level, or vice versa from, the continent going up? What are we seeing in those spaces?
So there has been the elusive creation of, or discussion also of, the European feminist foreign policy, that is the EU feminist foreign policy. And it's not there right now. There is a global agenda document that does not really entirely identify itself as feminist, but has feminist principles. It is in Europe that the first foreign policy document was developed by Sweden in 2014. And we had Foreign Minister Margot, who championed this adoption. And they publicly came out to say, we are now moving towards a feminist foreign policy. That is important because that is part of representation. Naming is a big part of the feminist and gender equality space. Because a lot of people, as you said earlier, do not want to identify. A lot of governments, a lot of political spaces do not want to identify as feminist. It is controversial. And a lot of feminists have also said sometimes they regret coming out as feminists because of the negativity that comes towards it, what they think you represent. So Sweden based its foreign policy, its feminist foreign policy, on three major things, which I said earlier: rights, representation, and resourcing. So what did this mean, basically? It meant that in its deliberations, in its programming, in its policy formulation, it will endeavor to center the representation, the resourcing, and the rights of women and girls. And this was also deliberately put in a space where this support will be as intersectional and as diverse as possible. And this meant that we will not leave behind women with disabilities, the LGBTQ community, women from rural areas, community representatives, young women, young men identifying as feminists as well. Everybody identifying as a feminist needed to be in this space. And so the pronunciation of that by Sweden created a new dawn where we had other governments coming on board, to European governments actually, and Western governments, USA and Canada coming on board. So far, we have 5 nations that have publicly also adopted a feminist foreign policy, amongst them Canada, Mexico, France, Luxembourg. And what this means is that they have been deliberate in their foreign missions, foreign aid, in ensuring that the women and girls are centered, they're resourced, and they're represented in all spaces. So representation is in decision making. Rights is ensuring their rights are protected, and resourcing means that not only talking about rights and representation, but putting money to actualize this representation. Right? If you want to include a woman with disability in your commission or in your board, you need to pay for her interpreter. Right? That's resourcing. You need to ensure that you have braille. That needs resourcing. So a big part of what is holding us behind in gender equality is also the investment of resources into engendering, the globe, the workspace, and everything. So this also meant that policies of, equal pay must be representative of the feminist foreign policy. And this also meant that the aid that came to Africa was representative of feminist principles, that representation of women was centralized, that the resourcing towards girls programs was advanced. And we have seen other countries, also come on board. We have seen the UK invest its highest ever resource towards women and girls, especially in education in Africa, resourcing curriculums, change and etc. We have seen Canada, resource specifically women representation programs, just ensuring that they build the capacity and agency of women leaders. And, interestingly, also their foreign minister or representative in Riyadh was expelled from Riyadh in Saudi Arabia. And, she was advocating for the release of women activists because this is front and center, taking a stand. And you'll find that in many spaces, the resourcing and the acknowledging of feminist principles and the naming of feminism is now being accepted. I think a small example is the United Nations Feminist Education Coalition, which is now being resourced by Germany, Netherlands, And as Antara, who's the executive director, was talking about it, she said, there was a question, why term it Feminist Education Coalition? Education is for all children. Why term education feminist? Because it's the principles of feminism, of equality, agency, intersectionality, need to reflect in the education system as well. And so we've had very many organizations trying to do that. But the issue we have with European nations has been they themselves also asking that, why are you propagating externally what you're not implementing internally? Some governments have been called out, for negating principles of equality, in various spaces in the running of governments. And also the precarious nature of the evolving and incoming, political governments that are coming in, not having it as an agenda. And, we are always at the mercy of the political space. What will the pundits say? How is, where is the wind going? And Europe itself, as a former colonial master, as a propagator of neocolonialism, for it to achieve or, implement a European feminist policy, they first must acknowledge and negate the current systems that propagate neocolonialism and bring on board Africa as a collaborator. But then because of nationalism, where each country wants to benefit itself, each negotiator comes on the table negotiating what is best for its country, it takes an exploitative turn. And so it has been elusive. There have been propositions of a feminist foreign policy for Europe, but all governments need to come together and say, this is what the EU needs to do that. But for them to do that, they'll have to sanction, probably, a few of its members who are not reflecting those principles. So it's, half and half either way.
Yeah. In terms of the African are there any nations or leaders that are agitating towards moving towards adopting this or buying into this feminist foreign policy?
What I can say is African leaders and governments have been beneficiaries of the feminist foreign policy, but they have not taken political stances in their own countries to name feminist foreign policy as an agenda. But a lot of governments have mainstreamed gender as a terminology in their governments and have attempted to ensure representation. Most of the times it's at a third representation of women or less, right? So naming is still a big issue in the gender equality space as well.
So because at the beginning you mentioned the huge role that civil society has played,
right?
Especially when you're talking about the Beijing conference, if I'm not mistaken. So in terms of the civil society now, how do you think, or from your perception, how do you think the feminist foreign policy will affect resourcing of civil society feminist organizations?
I think it will entirely affect resourcing, because a lot of money that the civil society uses also comes from some of these governments. As I said, Netherlands, was supporting, and Germany was supporting the Ungai family, are committed to support the Ungai Feminist Coalition. There's also the formation of the Alliance of Feminist Movements now that, is coming together to ensure diversity and representation and achieve solidarity, movement building of the women's movement in globally. So as recipients, it's a big part of the conversation. It's a big part that the aid that Africa receives needed to be feminist in nature, to address the issues of Africa. Because as I said earlier, sometimes the face of climate change is that of women and girls, and you will find that in the Generation Equality Forum, which was the relaunch of the 1995 Beijing Platform for Action, that happened in Mexico and in France, right? That direct correlation means that generation equality being anchored in France, as a host, meant that, whatever comes out of it will have direct correlations between Africa and Europe. Those are things that, we cannot negate or run away from.
Yeah.
So civil society right now runs on aid. They're non-profits. They run on donations. It is important that the money that they receive is reflective of that. And a big part of this conversation is also the philanthropies that have come up, the Bill and Melinda's, the Ford Foundations, and many others that are now a big part of the generation equality space. And generation equality as a space was particular in ensuring that they brought everybody to the table. Because before we would say private sector money is tainted, and we would say philanthropy money is tainted, but we said, how do we bring everybody together on board and change the capitalistic nature of exploitation to ensure that this exploitation and this marginalization does not remain a norm or a system, And so we've had people come on board. We've had civil society receive money from, we had like the ex-wife of the founder of Amazon, Jeff Bezos, for example, give money. And we had organizations like Frida Fund say, we recognize that this money has come from systems of Amazon that have been, oppressive in nature, but we will repatriate sort of this money to people that need it, and the backs on the people who this money was made. So civil society and the foreign feminist policy are intricately intertwined.
Yeah. So earlier on, you mentioned that African leaders have benefited from the feminist policy approach.
Right.
But you also then stated that at the same time, this hasn't been translated or inculcated at the national level in terms of like our principles, right? What would those principles look like?
Well, it would look like increased representation. It would look like fairer spaces of political participation. It would also look like men being on the ground championing gender equality. And I think that is the biggest thing that we lack in the gender equality movement. The uptake, the belief, and the acceptance of gender equality as a key principle of community living, day-to-day living. We say all politics is local. And so if a community, in whatever space in the world, does not inherently believe in the tenets of gender equality, if they continue to propagate, issues of patriarchy and chauvinism and etc., there's no way they will produce a representative that believes otherwise. And so changing this conversation at the grassroots is the most important part of this, movement as well. And having men and women who take a stand at the grassroots and say, this is the direction we need to take is very important. Very, very important. And we cannot say that leadership doesn't matter. The fish rots from the head, right? So when a government, when a president takes a stand, it trickles down. I will never underscore the value of Kenya's sort of peace deal that was brokered by Uhuru Kenyatta and Right Honorable Raila Odinga when they shook hands. We call it the handshake. We were at the brink of war all the time. Like the atmosphere was volatile. But that handshake and that belief system that we need to change the narrative of leadership, that it cannot always be one community, that, we need to address electoral issues and injustices, that changed the conversation. And that came from a leader, right? And today, even after the election, relatively, we're peaceful as a country. And so we cannot underscore the value, the political value, the political will of leaders to sway people, communities, grassroots towards, a certain direction.
Yeah. That's, you said a mouthful. And a lot of important points. And we've gone through the issue of feminism from the global perspective, bringing it down to, our continent, right? And unpacking some of the issues. And there's so much there. Like we're seeing so many problems and also some, solutions that are coming up. Some are at a snail's pace, but we're seeing movement.
We're getting there,
right?
Yeah.
For African feminist scholars,
Right.
this is a huge task.
It's a huge task,
Right?
because, we have not always given African scholars, not even the feminist space, African scholars, the respect and reverence that they deserve. When, I remember when we had COVID and this Nigerian doctor spoke about her cure, right? You could see the people standing behind her feeling very cringeworthy, and there's a global narrative that Africa has a sort of incapability because we are not a manufacturing continent. We are now just talking about innovation in Africa. We are resourcing it, but do we believe in it? Right. And so this is the issue also with African feminist scholars, and that is why we had to create a feminism that is for us, conceived by us, and propagated and championed and advocated for by us. And that is when we got the world to listen to this, different way of living, the African way of living, the African feminism, space. So it's the feminist scholars have put out a lot of information. They have put out a lot of theses and beliefs and opinion pieces. We've had feminists like Chimamanda who have at least gotten space in the global, arena to talk about but she had support having schooled, in US. So someone who is from Africa, educated from Africa, basically here, in the continent, putting forward a hypothesis. How well will you receive it, in Europe? How well will you propagate it? Not doubt it. Accept that that is the lived reality of her people, right? And so the African feminist scholars have contributed a huge lot to the technical capacity of propagating and communicating the feminism of Africa. But still, they are marginalized in the global scholarly space. And we hope to change that narrative. We hope that we get to listen, not only listen, but also validate the African experience for what it is. Because, things like Christianity were not African values. Wakanda is an African value, for example. Accepting and validating African heroes and bringing to the forefront our African stories and our African media, and culture more. So, and accepting that also that is a global level of scholarly excellence and material.
Great, Anika. So clearly, from this conversation, we clearly have a lot of work to do, and there's so much that is cut out for African feminist scholars, advocates on the ground, and people like yourself who are working in the space. On a lighter note now, I think our topic has been very heavy, but important, very important. You are leaving Europe. You've been here for 3 months at the EUI. What are the key things that you're going to take away with you that you'll go back and implement? Whether implement or that have provoked you to think about things in a certain way when you get back home in Kenya?
Well, there was a professor who came and taught us one day physically, and he said that the essence of this course, the essence of social sciences, is not to teach you much because you know quite a lot, but to evoke your thought process in critical thinking. And so the one thing I go back home with is the lens of critical thinking, of looking beyond the single story, the single dimension, of looking at the transnational perspective of cooperation and collaboration. I think that's the biggest thing that I look at, that existing in isolation, creating solutions in isolation is not entirely good, that we need to look at the ripple effects, the collaboration points. Who can we bring into the conversation? How do we promote the collaboration of Africa? And also, lastly, I would say it had made me think quite clearly about Africa's agency in the global space. How do we build on it? What should we do to build on it? Examining internally, why have we let the systems of neocolonialism go for so long? And how do we hold Europe to account, without emphasizing on their nationalist principles as well before coming to the EU as a whole? So yeah, those are the things I go back home with.
Great.
Yeah.
Anika? It's been lovely.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for your time, for your insights. And I wish you all the best. I have no doubt that you're going to go back home and make a difference to the lives of young girls and women in Kenya.
Thank you.